Nancy Sherman, what do you do for a living?
I have that glorious job of being a professor. I teach at Georgetown University, and this year I'm at the Woodrow Wilson Center as a public policy scholar, so occasionally I write books. I have time off to write books. And I talk to lots of veterans and soldiers about going to war and coming home, at least these days.
What's your connection to the Naval Academy?
I used to teach at the Naval Academy for 2.5 years. I was their inaugural Distinguished Chair in Ethics. They had a cheating scandal, and they're in the limelight, being near Washington, and they needed to brainstorm about how to teach ethics. And so they called me in, and before...
Why you?
Why me? That's a good question. I've taught ethics for years at Georgetown, for 20 years, and some of that before at Yale and as a graduate student. And they were surprised that there had been people that were teaching ethics as part of the curriculum. So we modified the course to talk about character in war and character of midshipmen and sailors and Marines. So it was fascinating. It was an absolutely fascinating tour of duty.
What's your educational background?
I went to Bryn Mawr College, proud women's college in Pennsylvania. And then I had a stint abroad. I have a degree from University of Edinburgh, so second home, you might say, is Scotland. And then I came back and I went to Harvard, so I have a PhD from Harvard.
In what?
In philosophy. And then after Harvard, I started teaching at Yale, where I was associate professor of philosophy, and then I came to Georgetown with a stint in at the Naval Academy and a few other lectureships here and there.
What did you learn? Was this your first exposure to soldiers when you went to the Naval Academy, or had you been exposed to them before?
Well, it's an interesting history. I'm of the era of Vietnam, and with a brother and a husband who were of age to serve in Vietnam. But in one case there was a graduate school deferment, my husband's case, and in another case my brother was for medical reasons not eligible. And that was, as you know, a momentous historical moment on college campuses in the late 60s, early 70s. And it was an unpopular war, and given that there was conscription, it was an especially unpopular war. So when I went to the Naval Academy, I ended up serving, as I like to say, because I did serve as a public servant, next to colonels Marine colonels who had been in Vietnam, and Navy captains who had been in the Mekong Delta, and Navy chaplains who had been in the Mekong Delta. So my formative years came back to me, but now I was with individuals who had been there, as opposed to those who had been in the mall in Washington protesting the war. But also what came back to me, and probably the most significant full circle for me, was that my dad is a World War II veteran. He was a medic. And he was silent, of a laconic generation that never spoke. And when I showed that I had real professional credentials now with some military, and they had stripes and badges, my dad took an interest and he began talking about his war. And as a daughter of a silent World War II veteran, that was about the most wonderful thing that could happen. He opened up a life for me.
Well, Dr. Nancy Sherman, your most recent book is called The Untold War: Inside the Hearts, Minds, and Souls of Our Soldiers. And I just want to read a little passage here and then have you expand on it if you would. And this is from the prologue. And you write, "Soldiers are genuinely torn by the feelings of war. They desire raw revenge at times, though they wish they wanted a nobler justice. They feel pride and patriotism tinged with shame, complicity, betrayal, and guilt. They worry if they have sullied themselves, if they love their war buddies more than their wives or husbands, if they can be honest with the generation of soldiers that follow. They want to feel whole, but they see in the mirror that an arm is missing, or having bagged their buddy's body parts, they feel guilty for returning home intact. I suspect many have talked to me, you, so openly because they sense they are being listened to by someone who may help them find, in the chaos of war, a small measure of moral clarity.
Well, I think that book, that whoever wrote that, myself, captures much of what I aimed to do in the book and hope I achieved. The book is testimonials from soldiers. The person who looks at herself in the mirror was one of my students, or a student at Georgetown, Dawn Halfacre, who was a West Point graduate, a basketball player, star basketball player at West Point, and went and headed up a unit of security detail in Iraq and in the Dilyat province, and all was quiet. She had enormous trust for those that she was training, the Iraqis, and then one night they were ambushed, and she lost her arm, and she was in a coma, medically induced for 2 weeks or so, and when she woke up at Walter Reed here in Washington, she was all wrapped in white blankets, and her parents began to tell her what happened, and she said, "I don't want to know." It was hard, but then she went on to be a remarkable patient, to make a physical exercise program that was tougher than any physical therapist could put together, and runs as a CEO of a Beltway Bandit kind of consultancy for the military. And so, these stories of resilience, but then there'll be a little glimmer. She said to me, in a moment I remember, she said, occasionally I'll be in a store, Kmart or something, and I catch a glimpse of myself in the mirror, and something's missing, and I feel freakish. Or she went with other vets to a beach in San Diego, and she's from San Diego, and she said the water felt so good on her body. She was wearing a little capped top, and she said, but I don't think I'll ever wear a bathing suit again. So these are losses, and I'm very much reminded of a vet I'm speaking to now, who's again an outpatient at the Walter Reed Bethesda Naval Hospital here, 2 years. And his parents, whom I spoke to as well, said, Dan had a beautiful body, and he's lost mobility. He lost his both legs and use of an arm, but he's rehabilitating with remarkable prosthetics and kind of bionic legs, and with a hard driving, alpha male kind of ability that many military men and women have. That's amazing. So I get enormous inspiration. This is not a essay on warmongering. It's not an essay on the warrior cults or glorifying. It's the truth. It's trying to be honest. These are they're non-conscription professional Army men and women, sailors, Marines, Air Force men and women that we often don't know because less than a percent of our population serves, and yet they're so remarkable often.
So, Professor Sherman, why you? Why are they talking to you?
Well, that's a very good question. When I went to the Naval Academy, I often thought I learned more than I taught because this was a culture that I had been kept away from, given my background. And my dad kind of kept me out of it because you didn't talk about war in a nice family, especially if you came home from war and wanted to begin again in the mid-40s, as my dad did. Why me? I have a background also in psychoanalysis. I don't see patients, but I've had a fair bit of training. And so I think it's critical not just for me, but for any of us who see our returning service members to listen with empathy and without judging. They want to be heard, but they don't want to be sermonized to or prejudged. And so I think that's really a critical part.
Can you give us another example of someone you talked to in the book? Another story.
Sure. There's so